Two civilizations carved the same wound into history, 4,000 years apart. Different languages, different gods. The Sumerians pressed it into clay. The Enochic scribes burned it into scripture, and yet both described the exact same descent. Something higher looked down, crossed the boundary, and left humanity permanently altered. This is not mythology. This is not metaphor. This is a cover-up. The horror is not that gods existed somewhere far away. The horror is that the higher world came close enough to teach humanity directly. And once that knowledge entered human hands, it did not remain pure. It did not remain sacred. It became metal, weapons, ornaments, omens, desire, fear, organized violence. Two traditions, one forbidden contact, and civilization may be the scar it left behind. Chapter 1. The sky did not stay sealed. The Anunnaki were never a single race in the oldest Mesopotamian memory. They were a shifting class of gods whose names, roles, and locations changed across every surviving text. Sometimes they occupied the heavens, arranging divine authority above human reach. Sometimes they stood near the earth, close enough to decide the fates of kings. Sometimes they appeared in the underworld, judging where no living witness could follow. That instability is what makes them useful for theological horror. They refuse to stay in one clean category, one clean realm, one safe function. They move like authority passing through locked rooms, never fully visible, never fully absent. In Mesopotamia, the divine order did not sit politely outside civilization. It pressed into kingship. Irrigation, writing, labor, ritual, omens, death. A city was never merely walls arranged against the wilderness. A throne was never merely furniture beneath a ruler wearing ceremonial power. A canal was never simply water guided through mud by disciplined human hands. All of it existed under a pressure older than any king who claimed it. The Anunnaki, in this darker reading, are not just characters inside myths. They are the shape of administration itself. Cosmic power entering human order through systems, now turned toward the Enochic Watchers, where the atmosphere sharpens into something more dangerous. They are not remembered as harmless messengers drifting above the world. They descend from the higher realm into territory humanity thought was its own. They see the human realm. They choose to cross into it. The tradition does not make their fall feel accidental, confused, or tragically misunderstood. It makes it feel organized, as if heaven's breach required planning. They bind themselves by oath before the boundary is broken. They do not stumble out of heaven alone, ashamed before the first step. They move together, as if rebellion itself demanded a council and a shared curse. A detail changes everything. A mistake can be forgiven as weakness, confusion, or a momentary collapse. An oath feels like architecture, something built before the crime has even begun. Desire becomes structure. Structure becomes destiny. Once they descend, the human world no longer belongs entirely to itself. Something from above has entered the bloodstream of history and will not dissolve. And the first sign of infection is not thunder, not fire, not earthquake. It is instruction. Chapter 2. The same shape in different firelight. This is where the cheap version of the story would close the case too early. It would say the Anunnaki were the Watchers, and the Watchers were the Anunnaki, and that is that. But that certainty would weaken the horror and flatten two complex sacred traditions. The stronger fear is not identity stamped with a false seal of proof. The stronger fear is repetition, the same wound appearing under different mythic skin. Two traditions do not need to describe the same being to preserve the same wound. Sumer did not need Enoch's language to imagine divine power descending into human affairs. Enoch did not need Sumer's ziggurats to imagine heaven breaking itself against earth. Both remembered the higher realm as dangerous when it came too close. Both understood that contact is not automatically blessing, not revelation, not salvation. When the upper world touches the lower one does not rise safely. It changes shape under pressure, like clay pressed by a seal it never chose. Civilization does not simply begin in light, order, and divine generosity. It begins with a shadow standing behind the teacher, watching what the lesson becomes. Chapter 3. the gift that became infection. The Watchers become terrifying because they do more than descend into the human world. They teach, and that makes their fall harder to contain than any single rebellion. That is worse than appearing in glory above a mountain. A presence can leave. A lesson remains inside the one who received it. In 1st Enoch, Azazel teaches metalwork, weapons, ornaments, cosmetics, and hidden earthly materials. Other Watchers reveal enchantments, celestial signs, constellations, clouds, solar paths, and lunar courses. Read coldly, it sounds like the birth of knowledge, technical progress, the dawn of civilization. Read through the text's moral atmosphere, it becomes the birth of corruption. The problem is not learning itself, and the story is darker because of that. The problem is knowledge removed from rightful order and placed into unstable hands. Metal becomes more than craft, more than tool, more than mastery over stone. It becomes the memory of violence sharpened into an object someone can carry. Beauty becomes more than adornment, more than color, more than ritual display. It becomes a surface where desire can be directed, disguised, and intensified. The stars become more than lights scattered above the sleeping fields. They become a system for predicting, controlling, fearing, and submitting to invisible patterns. This is why forbidden knowledge works so well as horror. It does not roar, it does not stalk, it does not reveal itself as a monster. It improves the world while quietly making the world less innocent. Now look back toward Mesopotamia, where civilization is also surrounded by divine pressure. The divine realm there also stands behind the machinery of human order. Gods are linked to wisdom, craft, incantation, kingship, purification, and the assignment of fate. Ea, the Akkadian Enki, carries associations with wisdom, purification, incantation, and culture-bearing skill. The gods do not only punish civilization from outside when it disobeys, they help explain why civilization exists at all. This is where the Anunnaki Watchers' parallel becomes sharp enough to cut. Both traditions remember higher beings connected to knowledge humans could not generate cleanly alone. In one world, divine order gives structure to cities, rituals, and sacred administration. In another, heavenly beings reveal mysteries that become corrupted after descent. Different moral frames, but the same dangerous mechanism breathing underneath. Knowledge comes from above, carrying the authority of a place humanity cannot reach. Then it passes through human hunger, ambition, fear, rivalry. What was cosmic becomes political inside the walls of a city. What was sacred becomes useful in the hands of kings and craftsmen. What was useful becomes violent before anyone remembers it was once holy. And by the time anyone calls it corruption, the tools are already everywhere. Chapter 4. When progress begins to look like a curse. By the middle of the story, the horror stops being vertical. It is no longer only about beings coming down from heaven or divine realms. It is about what remains after they leave their gifts behind. In Genesis, the earth is not described as merely confused, young, or morally uneven. It becomes corrupt and filled with violence before judgment finally gathers. The language feels environmental, as though wrongdoing has become atmosphere instead of event. The Book of Enoch sharpens that atmosphere into a chain of consequences. Descent brings forbidden instruction into the human world. Forbidden instruction intensifies human disorder until disorder becomes civilization's shadow. Human disorder becomes too widespread for ordinary correction or private repentance. The world itself seems to cry upward for judgment from beyond the visible sky. This is the nightmare behind the progress myth. What if civilization did not begin as pure advancement, courage, and invention? What if some of its first gifts arrived already carrying a curse? Chapter 3. The flood was not the beginning of the story. The flood is almost always treated as the main event. The moment everything breaks, the moment heaven finally answers. But in these traditions, water feels more like the aftermath than the cause. It arrives late, after the crossing, after the teaching, after the corruption has already spread into every layer of human life. Genesis places the Nephilim near the opening of the violence narrative, not at the end, not as footnotes, not as cautionary verses tucked behind the main plot. Then the earth becomes corrupt in the sight of God. Not merely confused, not morally uneven. Corrupt, as if the atmosphere itself had changed composition. Then the waters are announced as judgment over a world already altered beyond repair. The sequence is brutally short, the implication is vast. Heavenly boundary breaks, and what was above is no longer safely above. Human order changes beneath the crushing weight of forbidden contact. Violence fills the earth until the earth itself seems unable to contain it any longer. Water comes as judgment, but also as removal. A cleansing too late to be called prevention. This is not mythology. This is a record of cosmic contamination being surgically cut out. Enochic tradition expands that compressed terror into a full spiritual catastrophe. The Watchers do not fall by accident or stumble into disgrace. They descend by oath, turning transgression into a collective structure sealed before the first foot touched ground. They teach arts that should never have entered the world through this channel. Metalwork, cosmetics, enchantments, celestial signs. The hidden paths of the moon and sun. Giants and violence dominate the landscape of memory like moving monuments of consequence. The cry of the earth rises upward because the damage has become too large for silence. Judgment answers from the same direction the corruption first crossed, from above. The flood becomes not merely punishment, not merely anger, not merely divine disappointment. It becomes removal. It is the attempt to wash out what descent planted so deep in the world that no human hand could reach it. And yet, here we are still talking about it. Now, turn toward Mesopotamia, where the flood carries its own unsettling echo. In Atrahasis, the gods do not begin by judging humanity from a safe celestial distance. They begin by laboring, suffering, complaining beneath the crushing burden of work. Humanity is created so that the burden can be transferred downward, from divine shoulders to mortal clay. Existence begins, in that story, with service built into the very substance of the creature. Then humanity multiplies, noise rises, and divine discomfort becomes dangerous. Enlil does not move toward destruction in chaos, confusion, or rage without form. He moves by decision, calculated, cold, a surgical response to unbearable noise. Ea warns Atrahasis, allowing survival to pass through a hidden opening in the coming silence. Again, the waters are not random weather, not meaningless disaster, not nature turning feral. They are divine crisis management after the created order became unbearable to its own creators. They are the higher world trying to correct a lower world it helped create. And that is the terrible bridge between the traditions. The sky gives knowledge, labor, order, contact, command, or forbidden instruction. Then the waters come to erase the evidence, but not the memory. The memory survives. The memory always survives. It passes from clay tablet to forbidden book, from priest to scribe, from one doomed civilization to the next. It waits beneath every foundation stone, inside every ancient canal, behind every star chart hung above a throne. Final climax, the descent, never fully ended. Maybe the Anunnaki and the Watchers were not the same beings. Maybe they were separate sacred languages for different visions of cosmic intrusion. Separate cultures, separate centuries, separate gods wearing different names above different empires. But the pattern remains standing after every careful correction and every scholarly caution. It refuses to collapse under the weight of academic precision. Above, descent, instruction, corruption, flood, survival, memory. That sequence is older than most kingdoms and harder to kill than any single theory. It does not need one name to be true. It does not need one pantheon to remain dangerous. It suggests humanity did not fear ignorance most of all. It feared being taught by the wrong power, by something that should have stayed sealed above the sky. What if the first cities were not only monuments to human genius, not only triumphs of engineering, organization, irrigation, and sacred architecture? What if every wall carried the echo of descent? Every blade, every throne, every tablet pressed with cuneiform wedges. Every star chart used to predict the fate of a king. Not proof, not certainty, not a verdict you can close inside a single book, a stain in the structure. Too old to remove and too familiar to ignore. The kind that survives translation from clay tablet to forbidden book without losing its shape. The kind that waits until someone notices the same shadow falling twice, 4,000 years apart. Different languages, different gods. Same descent, same scar. This is not mythology, this is not metaphor. This is a cover-up that civilization itself may have been built to hide. So answer this before the archive closes. Did humanity invent descent or remember it? If the pattern disturbed you, leave your verdict where the watchers can still read it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and descend with us into the next forbidden archive, because the next descent may already be written above you.